Nicholas, let me ask you about Xi, because he made two stops on the Iberian Peninsula. Of course, before he hit the G20, he stopped in Spain, and then it was kind of bookend. At the end of his four-nation visit, he stopped in Portugal. Let's listen to what the CEO of Portugal's Agency for Investment and Foreign Trade had to say about China and its relationship with Lisbon.
We're undergoing quite a severe crisis, and so actually some of these Chinese investment was absolutely crucial for the survival of some of these companies. This was, I'd say, the energy boost that some of these companies needed at that right moment. So in that sense, it was of utmost importance.
Nicholas, fair assessment?
Well, I think that the investments, I cannot talk about Portugal, but I know that the investments that Chinese state-owned companies did in Greece, in particular in the main port, the port of Piraeus, have been very useful to Greece. Greece, after 8 years of a financial crisis, is strapped for investment. And those investments that have been done over the last decade or so have been, in my opinion, very useful. We have also seen a large number of Chinese citizens moving to Greece to take advantage of citizenship or residence in Greece as well. So as far as Greece is concerned, the close relationship with China has been beneficial.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Greece and Portugal, for that matter. Portugal and China, their relationship, they were 28th in trade back in 2008. Of course, the economic crisis hit. Now, China in the last decades moved up to 11th as a trading partner. In many respects, China's given a lifeline, not just to Greece, but Portugal. And a lot of the countries in the EU who are wary about this relationship seem to be the same sort of countries that were pushing for, handcuffing these two countries with austerity measures. Talk to us about that.
Well, I wouldn't call it handcuffing. I mean, the Greece and Portugal benefited tremendously from the fact that the European Union was willing to lend to both countries money at very low interest rates and for a long term. So that was very useful for both countries. At the same time, we do see to some extent of protectionism. For example, let me give you an example. There is one of the Chinese investments in Greece is on the high voltage system of the electricity distribution. Now, there is also a significant investment that is going to connect the mainland of Greece with one of the biggest islands, Crete. And one of the bidders is a Chinese company, a Chinese state company. And the European Union regulatory authorities have talked to the Greek regulatory authorities saying, well, you should consider any Chinese company that is under the state to be essentially the same company, and we have to be careful not to allow another Chinese company to have control over that cable, since the high voltage setup has already a significant participation from China. So there is resistance, and I can see that. At the same time, you can see that the interests of Greece, the national interests of Greece, would be to get the best possible deal for any investment, any new infrastructure investment. So there is a bit of a tension between what the guys want in Brussels and what the government wants in Athens.
Peter, let's talk a little bit more about this, because I think it gets to the heart of what you were saying, that people don't really understand China. There's this wariness that Nicholas just alluded to. How does China navigate that?
Yeah. I said for China, it's of course a difficult position, because on the one hand, they are facing a lot of concerns, a lot of criticism also. On the other hand, China has also caused a lot of positive effects, as I already mentioned, in terms of economic growth in the West. And China is sort of in a dilemma how it can deal with this issue. But I think a very important part of dealing with this issue is actually to create more understanding what China is, what its development is and where China is in its development. Because a lot of people think, well, China is now, it's the second economy of the world, it's basically taking over the world, and what should we do with that? But that's actually a complete misconception of where China is in its development and what that development can offer us in the West for kind of opportunities. I mean, you have to realize that China is still developing, and it's not a high-income country like the United States. China is facing a lot of major developmental issues and dilemmas. And in facing these dilemmas, for example, it's urbanization, or how to deal with poverty, or how to deal with social security and social welfare. These are a lot of huge issues that China is facing, and these are actually a lot of issues also where there is a lot of opportunity, ample opportunities for synergy and cooperation with the West. So these are things that a lot of people actually don't realize, because they just see the sort of alarmist reports in the media, and that creates a lot of fear. And I think it's really not it's not beneficial, and it's not it doesn't really work.
David, let's talk a little bit more about misconceptions, criticisms. One of the criticisms we hear from the African continent is that China comes over, it does all of these projects, but it brings Chinese workers. It's not employing enough people on the continent. And I was looking at a World Bank report. On average, Chinese businesses in Kenya employ 360 local employees, and that's actually far greater than the average of 147 locals employed by other foreign enterprises in the country. Talk to me about that criticism, and is China doing a better job of trying to dispel those kind of fears on the continent?
Certainly, you're right to observe what has been happening. The narrative across the continent, of course, is that China's lending practices and even its aid is predatory, and that it's putting national economies within Africa in debt traps. And of course, this is largely unfounded. Countries, yes, do have challenges around their fiscal management and how, particularly around debt management and so forth. I think the misgiving here has been the lack of information and knowledge, particularly as espoused by the Chinese, to sort of dispel, the unfactual basis around which this narrative has taken hold across the continent. But if you look at the projects singly, as you've pointed out, there are indeed some quite positive impacts of Chinese investments, even around employment generation and so forth.
So you're in Kenya. Talk to me about the benefits the country's seeing in terms of China coming in, employing locals there.
Yeah, certainly there has been big benefits. As you know, Africa has a huge ambition towards industrialization by modernizing its agriculture as well as improving its manufacturing. And the hope of that is that they can be able to create the kind of employment that will take up its youthful workforce. What China's support has gone towards has been to lay the much needed infrastructure around roads and railways as well as ports. And through this infrastructure, then there can be a boost of intra-African trade, which has been shown to be, where Africans actually trade their value-added commodities. And so this is actually the cornerstone for Africa's industrialization. And so by enhancing Africa's infrastructure, it's a vote for intra-African trade, and through China's support, Africa can actually integrate in the global value chains and have access to even global markets. And what we've seen in Ethiopia and in Kenya and in some parts around Southern Africa, we have actually large employment opportunities that have come out as a result of that. As we know, Africa has an imbalance, a trade imbalance with China, where Africa imports a lot of finished commodities from China while exporting raw primary products. And China's policy towards Africa has been to try and now support Africa to at least move up the value add by strengthening the value chain, so that this trade imbalance can be achieved.
Nicholas, the European Union, of course, negotiates deals as a bloc. You've already talked to us a little bit about Greece and of course, Portugal have certain economic hardships. And their kind of approach is probably different than a France or a Germany. How do they negotiate all of that? And talk to me about the different ways that China is viewed from the different countries.
Well, the countries that are better off than Portugal and Greece have a better negotiating position towards any outsider, including China. Generally, the European Union, you should see the European Union as a common project in which the European Union gives priority to internal investments compared to external investments, and that is a stated goal. And therefore, they're not very keen to allow large foreign investments, and that includes China. I mean, but it's not just about China. I mean, the European Union would be careful about large investments from other parts of the world as well.
Yeah. Well, Isaac, Latin America, you mentioned it earlier, a lot of infrastructure projects. Of course, this is an area that saw a boom in commodities, and yet there was a World Bank study that showed the density of paved roads in the region, for example, remained stagnant for the past 4 decades. So going in there doing infrastructure is going to be vitally important for the region, isn't it?
There is tremendous demand for infrastructure investment in Latin America. Particularly because the existing infrastructure has deteriorated considerably. So it needs repair, it needs investment. So any kind of investment in these sectors is welcome, I think. And the region has been attractive for some investors. For instance, you've seen some investments from China that are not necessarily related to infrastructure or trade. But I give you the example, for instance, the construction of a stadium, a soccer stadium in the middle of San Jose, Costa Rica, which is an impressive piece of construction, which brought to Costa Rica many workers from China, because the stadium was built by workers from China. Some of them stayed, and as a consequence, San Jose, Costa Rica has today a Chinatown.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. You see some other benefits. Latin American countries, though, as you mentioned earlier, have kind of a delicate balancing act because they have this relationship with the United States. They want some of these countries want stronger ties with China, yet they know that you kind of have to thread the needle. How difficult is that?
Well, the fact that China has become a main trading partner for several countries in South America, particularly, is a change, an impressive change in the economic geography of the region. And as I mentioned, you have Chile, Brazil, Uruguay, for instance. So that, I think, will continue. But we have to consider the fact that the Chinese economy is also slowing down. And the Chinese economic model is changing as well. Because China is turning around its economy towards its domestic market. Because China has the biggest market in the world. It's a matter of purchasing power, that you have to improve. But turning around the Chinese economy from an export-oriented, because you cannot understand Chinese progress in the last 40 years without the export sector. The success of the Chinese economy was exports. Now, how do you turn around the Chinese economy towards the domestic market and keep up these relationships of supplies and trade with the rest of the world is one of the main enigmas that we face today.
Well, Peter, why don't you take a stab at that question? How does China navigate all of that?
Well, this is an enormous big question. To turn from an export-oriented economy more towards domestic market first means that domestic consumers should start to consume. And one of the biggest problems is that a lot of consumers are actually wary to consume because they are worried about their social welfare. Talk about pensions, talk about healthcare. So they have a lot of liquidity in their savings. And China is a country that has enormous savings, personal savings. And this is something that needs to change over time, and it will take quite some time to make that transformation. But it has all to do with building up a solid social security system. And China is in the midst of that. It's starting that in the countryside. And the countryside is, of course, a major challenge because it's much more difficult to reach people. So these are some of the measures that China is taking against the larger backdrop of trying to transform this whole economy focused on export more towards domestic market.
Peter, briefly, because I wanted to touch on these things before we go, climate change, its leadership there, what role does China play there, continuing to push that, and also a larger footprint when it comes to UN peacekeeping. Talk to us about that as well.
Well, climate change is a big topic. What you can see is that China has been sort of navigating between its own national interests, which is, of course, having a developing status, and in terms of the per capita carbon emissions, that they are far behind the United States. On the other hand, China is showing much more assertiveness in trying to have a bigger role on the international scene. And in that sense, China, in terms of climate change, is actually much more a partner, for example, with the European Union in trying to combat climate change vis-à-vis the United States. China is trying to become a global responsible player. And that is a path that will take some time. It's also a path in which China has to take more lessons, but it is an inevitable path because of the size of its economy, because of the size of the economy that China is going to be. And in that sense, you see that China is really taking on more and more responsibilities, also in terms of peacekeeping. And that is, of course, a very positive sign that we see over the past years happening.
Well, we'll leave it there. Thanks so much for such a great, robust discussion. Really appreciate it. And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Mike Mulder in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.